I never thought a simple glance could unravel my life so completely. It started the day my mom told me she was getting married again. She was glowing, happy, and honestly, I was happy for her too. I knew this new man treated her right, and I'd always wanted her to have that kind of love. But then, she asked me to help her with the wedding, and that's when everything changed. You see, I wasn't prepared for her best friend to be around so often. Her best friend, Chloe, the woman who always seemed so put together, confident, and, well, gorgeous. I'd known her for years. She'd been a fixture at family events, always with that easy smile and a laugh that could light up a room. But suddenly, things felt different. Or maybe I had changed. We were planning a simple backyard wedding, nothing too fancy. But as we spent hours going over every tiny detail, Chloe and I were constantly together. At first, it was harmless, small talk, laughter over coffee, exchanging looks when my mom got too carried away with some wild idea. But soon, the air between us thickened with something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to explain. I kept telling myself, it was nothing. I mean, she was my mom's best friend, for God's sake. I was 24, and she was in her 40s, way out of my league, way out of bounds. But every time we were alone, every time our hands accidentally brushed or our eyes lingered a second too long, it became harder to ignore. The turning point came one evening when we were finalizing the seating chart. My mom had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's events, leaving just the two of us at the dining table. It was late, the house quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling wood. Chloe leaned back in her chair, stretching out her legs, a soft sigh escaping her lips. I glanced at her, intending to look away, but my eyes stayed. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. "What's going on in that head of yours?" she asked, her voice low and teasing, but with an edge of curiosity that felt dangerous. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Nothing," I muttered, looking back at the seating chart, pretending to care about where Uncle Frank was going to sit. She stood up, moving around the table to stand beside me, her arm brushing mine as she leaned over to examine the chart. Her perfume, subtle but intoxicating, filled my senses, and I could feel the warmth of her body so close to mine. "You're a terrible liar," she whispered, her lips inches from my ear. And then she did something I'll never forget. She reached out and gently placed her hand on my arm, a soft, almost casual touch. But it wasn't casual. Not to me. I turned to look at her, and in that moment, everything changed. There was no denying it anymore, the pull between us, the electric tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Her eyes locked onto mine, and before I knew what I was doing, before I could even think to stop myself, I leaned in. My lips barely grazed hers, a hesitant, fleeting touch, as if testing the waters of something forbidden, something dangerous. I pulled back, heart pounding, guilt flooding my chest. "I am sorry," I stammered, standing up quickly, putting distance between us. But Chloe didn't look shocked. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving mine, and I knew in that moment she had been feeling it too. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Every touch felt like a spark, every glance like a secret shared between us. But as much as I wanted her, the guilt gnawed at me. My mother's best friend. How could I do this? How could we do this? We tried to keep our distance. There were days when Chloe would barely speak to me, when she'd stay on the other side of the room, her eyes avoiding mine. But then there were nights when we'd find ourselves alone again, when the tension became too much and the boundaries blurred all over again. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though that was undeniable. There was something deeper, a connection I couldn't explain. We talked about everything. Her failed marriage, my fears about the future, things I'd never shared with anyone. And somehow, in the midst of all the chaos, I felt understood in a way I hadn't before. But the more I fell for her, the more complicated things became. My mom was happier than I'd seen her in years, and Chloe was a huge part of that. If she knew what was going on between us, it would destroy her. And I couldn't bear to do that. I tried to end it, to tell Chloe we couldn't keep doing this, that it wasn't right. But every time I thought I had the strength to walk away, she'd look at me with those eyes, and I was pulled back in. The night before the wedding, everything came to a head. We were setting up for the big day, hanging lights in the backyard, when Chloe and I found ourselves alone again. My mom had gone inside to take a call, and suddenly, it was just the two of us in the soft glow of the fairy lights. The tension was unbearable. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Chloe turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Neither can I." But instead of walking away, instead of ending things like we both knew we should, she stepped closer. Her hand reached for mine, and in that moment, all the guilt, all the fear, melted away. All that mattered was her. She kissed me then, soft at first, but with a hunger that mirrored my own. It was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment, I didn't care. We were wrapped in each other, lost in the heat of the moment, when the back door opened. The sound snapped me out of my daze like a bucket of cold water. I pulled away from Chloe, heart pounding, as we both turned toward the door. My mother stood there, her hand frozen on the handle, eyes wide with confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Shock? Betrayal? Horror? The world around me seemed to freeze, and all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. For a split second, none of us moved. Chloe's breath hitched, her hand still gripping my arm, and I could feel her entire body tense beside me. My mom's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "What's going on?" The air between us was suffocating. I could feel Chloe's pulse through her fingers, still gripping my arm. I looked at my mom, then at Chloe, searching for any way out of this, some explanation, some excuse, but none of it made sense. Nothing I could say would erase what she had just seen. It's not, I stammered, but the words fell flat, my throat closing around them like they were too heavy to speak. Chloe stepped forward, her hand falling from my arm, and suddenly, the distance between us felt like a chasm. She opened her mouth to say something, but my mother's gaze turned to her, eyes narrowing, and Chloe faltered. "We were just talking," Chloe said, her voice strained but steady. "It's not what it looks like." But even as she said it, the lie hung in the air, brittle and fragile, and we all knew it. My mom's expression shifted from confusion to something darker. "Hurt. Talking?" my mother repeated, her voice tight. "That's what you call that?" I opened my mouth to try and explain, to apologize, to do something to make this better, but I had nothing. The truth was too tangled, too raw to unravel here now. I couldn't take it back. I couldn't undo the pull that had been building between Chloe and me for weeks, and now there was no hiding it. My mother's eyes flickered to me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "How could you?" Those three words sliced through the air, sharper than I could have imagined. They weren't loud, but they hit like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of shame wash over me, the weight of what I'd done settling in all at once. "Mom, I started, but she held up a hand, cutting me off. "No," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Don't." The silence that followed was unbearable. Chloe took a step back, as if retreating from the wreckage of what we had done, her face a mask of regret. My mother looked between us, the hurt in her eyes so deep I could barely stand to meet her gaze. "I trusted you," she said, turning to Chloe now, her voice laced with betrayal. "You were my best friend." Chloe's lips parted, but she didn't respond. What could she say? The truth hung between them like a live wire, impossible to ignore. I could see Chloe's guilt, her shame, but I could also see something else, something that mirrored what I felt. Regret. Not for what we shared, but for being caught, for the destruction we had caused. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Chloe finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." My mom's laugh was hollow, a bitter sound that cut through the tension like a knife. "Sorry? You're sorry?" I could see the pain written across her face, and for the first time, I realized the full extent of what I had done. This wasn't just about Chloe and me. This was about trust. My mother's trust in both of us, shattered beyond repair. She shook her head, stepping back toward the door, and I could see the tears welling in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. "I don't even know who you are," she said, her voice breaking, and it was clear the words were meant for both of us. She turned, pushing the door open with trembling hands, and disappeared back into the house. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound echoed in the silence that followed. I stood there, staring at the closed door, my chest tight with the weight of everything that had just happened. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it was something even harder to admit, something I didn't want to face. The undeniable truth that despite everything, I still wanted Chloe. Even now, standing in the ruins of what we had just destroyed, the pull between us hadn't faded. "I should go," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking as she turned to leave. She took a few steps toward the back gate, but something in me couldn't let her go. "Not like this." "Wait," I said, grabbing her wrist. She stopped, but didn't turn around. The weight of the moment, of everything we'd just lost, hung between us. Slowly, she looked back at me, and in her eyes I saw the same mix of regret, desire, and confusion that was tearing me apart. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't just walk away from this, from her, no matter how much it would cost. The road ahead was uncertain, and everything had changed in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was clear: there was no going back. "We'll figure it out," I said, though the words felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself as much as her. Chloe nodded, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer, before she finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. As the last traces of her disappeared, I stood alone in the backyard, the soft glow of the lights around me feeling cold and distant. Everything felt different now, tainted, broken. I looked toward the house, toward the door my mother had walked through, and I knew I'd have to face her. But not tonight. Tonight, the weight of my choices sat heavy on my chest, and I didn't have the strength to deal with the consequences. But they would come, sooner than I wanted. For now, all I could do was stand there, staring into the dark, trying to remember how it had all started so innocently, and how, somehow, it had spiraled so far out of control.